At 11:32 on the morning of December 20, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant Charlie Brown held the controls of his B-17 bomber above Bremen, Germany as 250 anti-aircraft guns opened fire on his formation. He was 21 years old with no combat missions completed. This was his first. The German gunners below were not regular troops. They were officer candidate trainees who were highly trained and among the most accurate shooters in the Luftwaffe. They had been waiting for the American bombers all morning. Brown's aircraft was named Ye Old Pub. It carried 10 crew members and 6,000 pounds of bombs. The target was a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter factory near Bremen. Intelligence officers had warned crews during the morning briefing that they would face many German fighters. What they did not say was that Brown's assigned position was the most dangerous place in the formation. The men of the 379th Bombardment Group called it Purple Heart Corner. It was at the edge of the formation where enemy fighters attacked first because defensive fire from nearby bombers could not fully protect it. New crews were often placed there. Brown's crew was the newest. Before Ye Old Pub could drop its bombs, a 20-pound cannon shell exploded in front of the cockpit. The plexiglass nose shattered. At 27,000 feet the temperature was 60 degrees below zero. Wind rushed through the aircraft at over 150 miles per hour. The No. 2 engine failed at once. The No. 4 engine began to overspeed, forcing Brown to reduce power to avoid failure. The bomber slowed and the formation moved ahead. Within seconds Ye Old Pub was alone. German fighters saw it immediately. Around 12 to 15 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s moved in on the damaged bomber like predators. The attack continued for more than 10 minutes. The No. 3 engine was hit and dropped to half power. The oxygen system broke. Hydraulic lines failed. The electrical system stopped working. The tail section was heavily damaged by cannon fire. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, was struck by a 20 mm shell and killed instantly. Most of the crew were injured. Brown himself was hit by a fragment in his right shoulder. The extreme cold froze the oil in the guns. Out of 11 machine guns only 3 still worked. Then the oxygen supply ended. At 27,000 feet the human brain cannot function without oxygen support. Brown felt his vision closing and his hands went numb on the controls. His co-pilot Spencer Luke was already unconscious. Brown's final thought before losing awareness was that his crew would die on their first mission. Ye Old Pub began to fall. The bomber dropped from 27,000 feet in an uncontrolled dive. The speed passed 300 miles per hour. The airframe shook hard and the wings could have broken at any moment. Then something unexpected happened. At about 1,000 feet above the ground, Brown regained consciousness. The thicker air at low altitude gave him enough oxygen to recover. He took the controls and pulled back with all his remaining strength. The B-17 leveled out just above the treetops in northern Germany. Brown looked around. There was blood in the cockpit and wounded crew everywhere. The tail gunner was dead. The aircraft was heavily damaged. He had also flown directly over a German fighter airfield. On that field a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109. He had already destroyed 2 American bombers that morning. One more would earn him the Knight's Cross, which was one of Germany's highest awards. He looked up and saw Ye Old Pub struggling through the sky at about 100 feet. If you want to know what Franz Stigler did next when he reached Brown's damaged bomber, consider supporting the video and subscribing for more. Returning to the story, Stigler entered his fighter and started the engine. Within minutes he was airborne and closing the distance quickly. He moved into position behind the B-17 with his finger on the trigger of his machine guns and cannon. One short burst would be enough to secure the award. But what Franz Stigler saw through his sight changed his understanding of war and honor and the enemy he had been taught to fight. Franz Stigler was 28 years old. He had flown 487 combat missions. He had been shot down 17 times. He had escaped from burning aircraft 6 times and crash-landed damaged planes 11 more times. His brother August, who was also a pilot, had died in 1940 when his Junkers 88 crashed during a night mission over England. The war had taken nearly everything from him except his flying skill and his personal code. Before the war he had worked as a commercial pilot for Lufthansa. He had flown passengers across Europe during peacetime and had never expected that he would spend years fighting men he had never met. But Germany had called and Stigler had answered. By December 1943 he had become one of the most experienced fighter pilots in Jägerschwader 27. Now he was closing in on the tail of a damaged American bomber with 27 confirmed victories. One more heavy bomber would meet the requirement for the Knight's Cross. The award would honor not only him but also his brother who had died. It would show that the Stigler family had given everything for Germany. His Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 was not in perfect condition. Earlier that morning during his attack on 2 bombers an American .50 caliber bullet had struck his radiator. The engine could overheat but Stigler still took off. The damaged B-17 was too easy to ignore. He approached from behind and below, which was the standard attack angle. His finger moved to the trigger and his sight aligned with the tail of the American aircraft. Then Stigler noticed something that made him stop. The tail gunner position was destroyed. Through the large holes in the fuselage he could see the body of a young American slumped over his gun. Blood had frozen into long icicles from the broken turret. The man was clearly dead. Stigler moved his fighter alongside the bomber and looked through more openings in the aircraft. He saw injured crew members trying to assist each other. One man had blood covering his face. Another had a severe wound in his leg from shrapnel. He saw the pilot and co-pilot struggling to keep control of the aircraft. None of them were fighting. None of them were able to fight. They were only trying to stay alive. At that moment Franz Stigler remembered the words of Gustav Rodel, who had been his commanding officer in North Africa, where Stigler flew with Jägerschwader 27 against British forces in the Libyan desert. Rodel believed that war had rules. He believed that a fighter pilot's honor depended on how he fought, not on how many enemies he destroyed. He once told his pilots that if he ever heard of anyone shooting at a man in a parachute he would personally shoot that pilot. The message was clear. A man in a parachute could not defend himself, and killing him was not combat but murder. According to that code, such actions had no place in the conduct of a true fighter pilot. Stigler looked again at the damaged bomber beside him. The Americans were not in parachutes, but they were in a similar condition. They had almost no working guns. They had lost speed and could not defend themselves. Shooting them down would not be a true victory. It would be an execution. Stigler felt the rosary beads in his flight jacket pocket. His mother had once hoped he would become a priest. He chose to fly, but he had kept his faith. That faith told him that what he was about to do would be wrong. He made his decision. Franz Stigler would not shoot down the bomber. He would not kill these men. He would not earn his Knight's Cross in this way. But this decision created another problem. The American bomber was flying deeper into Germany on the wrong course. If Brown continued, he would pass over more airfields, more anti-aircraft guns and more fighters. Someone else would destroy the aircraft. Sparing them would not save them. Stigler moved his fighter closer to the B-17 cockpit. He could see the American pilot looking back through the damaged window. The young man's face was covered in blood and his expression showed fear. He expected to be attacked at any moment. Stigler raised his hand and pointed down toward the ground. He was trying to signal the American to land at a German airfield and surrender, which was the safest option. Charlie Brown did not understand. He believed the German was telling him to go down and crash. Brown shook his head. Stigler pointed again, this time toward the north in the direction of Sweden, which was neutral territory. If the Americans reached Sweden they would be held, but they would survive and receive medical care. Brown still did not understand and continued flying west toward England across 250 miles of sea in a heavily damaged bomber. Stigler realized that only one option remained and it carried serious risk. He decided not only to spare the bomber but to escort it to safety. In Nazi Germany this action could be treated as treason. A pilot who allowed an enemy aircraft to escape could face court-martial and execution. There would be no protection and no appeal. Stigler understood the risk and continued anyway. He moved his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into close formation beside the left wing of the B-17. The aircraft flew only a few feet apart. From the ground they could appear as a single shape. This positioning was deliberate. German forces sometimes used captured B-17 aircraft for training and special missions. Ground crews were trained to recognize such situations. If they saw a German fighter escorting a bomber, they might assume it was one of their own captured aircraft and not open fire. It was a risky decision, but it gave the Americans a chance. Inside Ye Old Pub, Charlie Brown watched the German fighter move into position beside him. He felt tension as he ordered his top turret gunner Bernd Cullen to aim but not fire. Brown did not understand the situation. He questioned whether the German pilot was delaying or setting a trap. The B-17 continued west toward the North Sea while the German fighter remained beside it for a long distance and time. Brown kept expecting an attack but none came. They flew over fields, villages and roads filled with German vehicles. At any moment someone on the ground could notice them. Anti-aircraft guns could open fire or another fighter could approach and question Stigler's actions. Yet nothing happened and the German pilot stayed with them. Eventually the coastline appeared and the North Sea came into view. Between Germany and England lay 250 miles of cold water. If Ye Old Pub could cross it, the crew would survive. If the engines failed over the sea, the outcome would be fatal. Before reaching safety they still had to pass the coastal defenses. The German Atlantic Wall extended along the full coastline of occupied Europe. Anti-aircraft batteries, radar stations and observation posts were placed across the region. Every stretch of beach was monitored and each aircraft crossing the coast was tracked and identified. An American bomber flying low and slow toward England would normally be an easy target. Stigler remained in formation. He flew extremely close to the B-17 so that his wingtip was nearly touching the bomber fuselage. He was forcing the anti-aircraft gunners into a decision. If they fired at the bomber, they would also risk hitting him. If they recognized his aircraft, they would choose not to fire. The plan worked. The coastal defenses did not open fire. Radar operators tracked two aircraft flying together and assumed they were friendly. Ye Old Pub crossed the shoreline and moved out over the cold waters of the North Sea. Franz Stigler had succeeded. He had escorted an enemy bomber through one of the most heavily defended airspaces in Europe and had preserved 9 American lives. However, he could not continue toward England. His fuel supply was low and his radiator was still damaged from the earlier hit. Landing in Britain would mean capture and the end of his role in the war. He had to turn back and return to Germany while keeping this event hidden. Stigler guided his fighter close to the B-17 cockpit one final time. Charlie Brown looked at him through the broken window and their eyes met. They were two young pilots from opposing sides of the war, separated by only a short distance. Stigler raised his hand in a salute to the American pilot. He then turned his aircraft to the left and disappeared into the sky as he headed back toward Germany. Brown watched him leave without fully understanding what had taken place. He did not know the identity of the German pilot or the reason for his survival. He only knew that a man who had the chance to destroy him had chosen not to do so. Charlie Brown still faced a serious situation. He was now 250 miles from England in an aircraft that was barely operational. 3 engines were damaged and the 4th could not be trusted. The hydraulic system had failed. The crew had no oxygen, no heat, and no working radio. 1 crew member had died and 6 others were injured. The morphine syringes had frozen and could not be used to treat wounds. The North Sea in December presented extreme conditions that left little margin for survival. Brown continued flying the damaged bomber over the cold sea. Below him the water moved under harsh winter conditions. The temperature was close to freezing, and if the aircraft went down, the crew would survive only a short time before hypothermia. The No. 2 engine was no longer working. The No. 3 engine was operating at reduced power. The No. 4 engine was unstable and could fail at any moment. Only the No. 1 engine was functioning normally. Brown required at least 2 engines to hold altitude, but he was operating with less than that. The airspeed indicator showed 140 miles per hour. Dangerously slow, the bomber was close to stalling and dropping into the sea. Brown pushed the throttles forward, trying to gain more power from the damaged engines. The aircraft shook but continued to hold its line. Behind him, the crew struggled to survive. The waist gunner Alex Yelisenko had suffered shrapnel wounds in his leg. The injury was serious, and without proper care he could bleed to death. The morphine syringes were frozen and the medical kit could not be used. His fellow crew members could only apply pressure and wait. The ball turret gunner Sam Blackford had lost feeling in his feet. The heating wires in his suit had failed during the attack. Frostbite had started to develop, and without warmth he risked losing his toes or even his feet. The radio operator Richard Pachter had been hit by a cannon fragment in his eye. His vision was limited, but he continued working as he tried to repair the damaged radio. He attempted to send distress signals every few minutes, but no reply came. In the tail section, Hugh Eckenrode remained where he had been killed. There was no way to move him and no time to focus on loss. The crew had to stay focused on survival. Brown calculated the distance ahead. 250 miles at 140 miles per hour meant nearly 2 hours of flight. 2 hours in an aircraft that could fail at any time. 2 hours over water so cold it could end their lives within minutes. He did not know if they would succeed, but he knew they had no other choice. Mile after mile the B-17 continued west. The engine struggled and the airframe carried heavy stress. Brown felt pain in his hands from holding the controls, and his shoulder hurt from the earlier injury, but he maintained control. He could not release his grip because 9 lives depended on him. After a long period, the coastline of England appeared in the distance. Brown recognized it immediately. Fields, cliffs and safety were now in sight. However, Ye Old Pub was too damaged to reach its assigned base at RAF Kimbolton. The hydraulic system had failed, which meant the landing gear and flaps might not function correctly. Brown prepared to land at the first available airfield. He located RAF Seething, which was used by the 448th Bomb Group, and aligned the aircraft for approach. The landing gear extended with difficulty and the flaps only partially deployed. Brown guided Ye Old Pub onto the runway in a controlled crash. The remaining landing gear broke off and the aircraft slid across the surface with sparks. When it finally stopped, Brown remained still in the cockpit with his hands fixed on the controls and his body shaking. He had succeeded in bringing his crew back. 8 men exited the aircraft alive while 1 was removed after death. The bomber was too damaged to fly again and was later returned to the United States, where it was sold as scrap. During the debriefing, Brown explained everything to the intelligence officers. He described the German fighter that had approached them from behind. He explained how the German pilot had flown beside them instead of opening fire. He described the moment when the pilot saluted before turning away. The officers listened without speaking. When Brown finished, they gave him a direct order. He was not allowed to speak about this event again. The story was classified. It could not be known that a German pilot had shown mercy to an American crew because it might create sympathy for the enemy. Brown followed the order and kept the secret. At the same time, Franz Stigler landed his Messerschmitt at his base near Bremen. He also remained silent about what had happened. If it became known that he had escorted an enemy bomber instead of destroying it, he would face court-martial and likely execution. Stigler kept the event to himself. 2 men on opposite sides of the war carried the same memory without being able to share it. Each wondered whether the other had survived. Each carried the weight of a moment of humanity during conflict. The secret remained for 46 years. The war ended in May 1945. Charlie Brown returned to West Virginia. He completed his education and later rejoined the Air Force in 1949. He worked in intelligence and advanced through the ranks until retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1972. After retirement he settled in Miami, Florida and started a combustion research business. Franz Stigler survived the war but faced a different reality. Germany was destroyed and the Luftwaffe no longer existed. He had flown the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet in the final months of the war, but even that advanced aircraft could not change the outcome. After the war he struggled to find work in Germany. In 1953 he moved to Canada and settled in Vancouver, where he built a successful business and began a new life. Both men continued to think about December 20, 1943. Brown often remembered the German pilot who had spared him. He questioned who the man was and why he had chosen mercy. He also wondered if he had survived the war. For many years he remained silent because of the order he had received. Stigler also thought about the American bomber. He questioned whether it had crossed the North Sea and whether the crew had survived. He considered whether his decision had been worth the risk, but he could not share his thoughts with anyone. The memory stayed with him. 43 years later in 1986 Charlie Brown was invited to speak at a military aviation gathering known as the Gathering of Eagles at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Retired pilots from different services attended the event. During a discussion Brown was asked if he had a memorable combat experience. For the first time in more than 4 decades he shared the story of the German fighter pilot. He described the damaged bomber and the enemy aircraft that appeared beside him. He explained how the German pilot saluted before leaving. The audience listened with deep attention. After the event Brown felt a need to learn more. He wanted to know what had happened to the German pilot who had spared his life. He decided to search for him. He contacted United States Air Force archives but found no records. He reached out to the West German Air Force with the same result. He wrote to historians across Europe but received no useful replies. Time passed and every attempt failed. The identity of the German pilot remained unknown. By 1989 Brown had few options left. He had spent 4 years searching without success. Many people advised him to stop and accept that the pilot might not be alive. Even if he was alive, finding him among many veterans seemed unlikely. Brown chose to continue. He wrote one final letter and sent it to a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots called Jägerblatt. In the letter he described the encounter in detail, including the date, the location and the aircraft involved. He asked if anyone could identify the German pilot. The letter was published in early 1990. A few weeks later Brown received a reply. The envelope came from Canada. Inside was a single page written carefully by hand. The letter began with 3 simple words that answered his question. I was the one. Franz Stigler had read the newsletter and recognized the story immediately. After 46 years of silence he finally learned that the American bomber had returned safely. The crew had survived and his decision had not been wasted. Brown read the letter with tears in his eyes. Stigler described his aircraft, the Escort, along the coast and the salute. Every detail matched Brown's memory. There was no doubt that this was the pilot who had saved him. Brown contacted directory assistants in Vancouver, British Columbia and asked for the number of Franz Stigler. The operator located it. Brown called with shaking hands. A voice answered, an older man with a German accent. Brown introduced himself and there was a pause. Then Franz Stigler began to cry. The 2 men spoke for hours. They discovered that they had lived less than 200 miles apart for many years. Stigler had been in Vancouver while Brown had lived in Seattle before moving to Miami. They had been close without knowing it. They agreed to meet later that summer in a hotel lobby in Florida. On a summer day in 1990 Charlie Brown entered the hotel lobby. He was 67 years old with gray hair and the marks of a past war. His heart was racing. Franz Stigler was already there. He was 74 years old with a face shaped by time and steady eyes that Brown recognized. The 2 men looked at each other across the room. For a moment they stood still. Then they walked forward and embraced. A friend of Brown recorded the meeting on video. The footage shows two elderly men holding each other and crying. When they finally stepped back, Stigler looked at Brown with relief. He had wondered for many years whether his choice had mattered. Now he knew it had. Brown brought photographs of his family, including his children and grandchildren. These were people whose lives existed because Stigler chose not to fire in 1943. Stigler looked at the images with emotion. He had never received the Knight's Cross and had not been formally recognized for his service. Standing there, he understood that what he had gained was more meaningful than any award. 3 months later, in September 1990, Brown and Stigler attended a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group in Massachusetts. The veterans invited Stigler as a guest of honor. They wanted to meet the pilot who had protected one of their crews. 2 surviving members of Ye Old Pub were present. Sam Blackford, the ball turret gunner, and Richard Pachter, the radio operator. Both had lived long lives after the war and had families of their own. They greeted Stigler with emotion and gratitude. They introduced him to their relatives. Many people in that room existed because of his decision. The group welcomed him as an honorary member. A German fighter pilot became part of an American bomber unit. Former enemies became close companions. The story began to spread. Newspapers reported it and television networks requested interviews. Brown and Stigler were invited to speak at museums, community events, and military gatherings across the United States and Canada. They often traveled together. The American bomber pilot and the German fighter pilot stood side by side and shared their experience with audiences who had never heard anything similar. Veterans in attendance showed strong emotion, and younger listeners expressed appreciation for the story. Stigler later gave Brown a book about German jet aircraft. Inside, he wrote a message. He explained that he had lost his brother in 1940 during the war. He wrote that on December 20, 1943, just days before Christmas, he had been given a chance to save AB-17 from destruction. He wrote that Charlie Brown had become as important to him as his own brother. He signed the message with the words, "Your brother." From that point they were more than friends. They became like family. They spoke often, visited each other, and spent time together regularly. Their connection remained strong for the rest of their lives. Their story reached people around the world. Many wrote letters explaining how it affected them. Some said it restored their belief in human values. Others said it showed that compassion can exist even during war. For Brown, there was still one concern. The crew of Ye Old Pub had not received official recognition for what they had endured. The mission had remained classified for many years, and their experience had not been fully acknowledged. Brown decided to act. He began writing to the United States Air Force requesting recognition for his crew. He wanted their experience to be properly recorded. The Air Force started a review and opened long classified records. In 2008, the United States Air Force completed its investigation into the events of December 20, 1943. The findings confirmed everything Charlie Brown had reported. The mission to Bremen, the heavy attack by German fighters, the death of Hugh Eckenrode, the injuries suffered by the crew, the difficult flight back across the North Sea, and the German pilot who chose mercy instead of victory. The Air Force made a decision that surprised many historians. Each surviving crew member of Ye Old Pub would receive the Silver Star, which is one of the highest awards for valor in combat. For those who had died, the medals would be given to their families. 9 Silver Stars for one bomber crew was an unprecedented action. The Air Force also made another decision. Charlie Brown would receive the Air Force Cross, which is the second highest award for a member of the United States Air Force. It is given only for exceptional heroism in combat. No other World War II bomber crew had ever been honored in this way. The men of Ye Old Pub became one of the most decorated crews in American aviation history. 65 years after their mission, they finally received the recognition they had earned. The ceremony was conducted with respect. Surviving crew members attended with their families, and relatives of those who had died came to accept medals on their behalf. Brown was present at 85 years of age. His body was weak but his determination remained strong. Standing beside him as he had for many years was Franz Stigler. Stigler had received recognition earlier. In 1993 the Combatants Federation of Europe awarded him the Star of Peace, which honors acts of humanity during wartime. He was one of the few German veterans to receive it. Stigler always stated that he did not deserve special praise. He believed he had only done what was right by refusing to kill defenseless men and by following a code that valued human life over military success. The story of Braun and Stigler reached people around the world. Journalists wrote about them and television programs shared their reunion. Documentary filmmakers recorded their experience. In 2012 author Adam Makos published a book about their story titled A Higher Call. The title reflected Stigler's own explanation of his decision. Makos spent years interviewing both men, visiting the locations involved and studying military records in the United States and Germany. The book became a New York Times bestseller. Readers were drawn to the story of two former enemies who became like brothers. Historians praised the careful research and veterans said it showed the reality of war and the decisions individuals must make. In 2014 a Swedish heavy metal band named Sabaton released a song about the event titled No Bullets Fly. The song introduced the story to a younger audience around the world. Many people who had not studied World War II learned about the German pilot who chose not to fire and the American pilot who searched for him for decades. In 2019 a surviving B-17 bomber operated by the Erickson Aircraft Collection in Oregon was painted in the markings of Ye Old Pub. The aircraft appeared at air shows across the United States and helped keep the memory of the crew alive. The events of December 20, 1943 became a symbol of something greater. They showed that even during total war, when nations expected complete hostility, individuals could make different choices. Franz Stigler gave up the chance to earn the Knight's Cross in order to save 9 lives. In return he gained something more meaningful than any award. He gained a lasting bond and a legacy that would continue beyond his lifetime. By 2008 both men were advanced in age. Stigler was 92 and Braun was 87. They had shared 18 years of friendship after their reunion. They had spoken regularly, visited each other and shared many experiences. These were years neither of them expected to have. Time was limited and both understood this. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008 at the age of 92 in Vancouver, British Columbia. The country had given him a new beginning after the war. His remains were handled according to his wishes. Charlie Brown received the news in Florida. The man he considered a brother had passed away. After years of friendship and shared memories, Stigler was gone. Brown felt deep loss but also a sense of peace. He knew that Stigler had learned the outcome. The B-17 had reached home and the crew had survived. The decision made in 1943 had truly mattered and had affected many lives. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown died in Miami at the age of 87. The two men who had first met as enemies in the skies over Germany and later formed a strong bond passed away in the same year. Their story continued to be shared after their deaths. Their legacy remained through books, music, and aviation history. The book A Higher Call continued to reach new readers each year. The song No Bullets Fly introduced their story to audiences unfamiliar with the war. The restored Ye Old Pub aircraft continued to fly at events across the United States, keeping their memory present. The most meaningful legacy was found in the families connected to the event. Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner who died over Bremen, was remembered by his relatives who later learned the full story. They found items related to the aircraft and preserved his memory. The families of the surviving crew members grew over time with children, grandchildren, and later generations. Every one of them existed because a German pilot chose not to fire. At reunions, when Stigler met these families, he was deeply affected. He had never expected to see the results of his decision so clearly. A large number of people standing before him existed because he remembered the words of Gustav Rodel and chose not to fire at men who could not defend themselves. Stigler once wrote a note to Brown that expressed his thoughts. He explained that he had lost his only brother in 1940. He wrote that on December 20, 1943 he had been given a chance to save AB-17 from destruction. He said that Charlie Brown had become as important to him as his own brother. He signed the note with the words, "Your brother Franz." The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is not only about war. It is about what remains after conflict ends. It reflects a sense of honor that goes beyond national identity. It shows how an act of mercy can influence many generations. Two young pilots met in the sky over Germany in 1943. One had the ability to destroy the other. The other had no way to defend himself. In that moment a decision was made that went against orders and expectations. Franz Stigler chose a different path and Charlie Brown lived the rest of his life aware of that decision. If this story has had an impact, take a moment to support it. Your engagement helps share it with more people. Consider subscribing and enabling notifications to follow similar historical accounts. These stories highlight real individuals and meaningful actions. You can also leave a comment and share where you are watching from. This community includes viewers from many countries and helps keep these memories active. Thank you for watching and for helping ensure that Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler continue to be remembered.